Good evening. Good evening and welcome, everyone. So nice to see you. Thank you. Thank you. So my name is Ganithan Kauri, and I am the Henry and Lois Foster Director and Chief Curator of the Rose Art Museum. I also curated the Roy Lichtenstein exhibition, Lichtenstein 100, that you could see next door. On behalf of the museum and the Department of Fine Arts here at Brandeis University, I'm delighted to welcome all of you to what promises to be an exceptional program in conjunction with the Lichtenstein exhibition that we currently have on view. The exhibition highlights the fact that the establishment of the Rose Art Museum and the birth of American pop art coincided in the early 1960s. On the occasion of Roy Lichtenstein's centennial, Lichtenstein 100 harks back to these formative years and our intersecting histories. The Rose, as you may know, opened its doors in 1961, declaring an unprecedented institutional commitment to collecting, and I'm quoting the founding director, Sam Hunter, advanced or experimental American art, end of quote. That year, as we will hear from the biggest expert around, Lichtenstein launched his signature style of painting, which was considered radical at the time due to its thematic and formal affinities with commercial art, comic books, and popular culture. Well, the next year, in 1962, Leo Castelli in New York gave Lichtenstein his first solo exhibition. And that very year, Brandeis University established an acquisition fund, the Gewürzminuten Purchase Fund, that enabled the museum's founding director, Sam Hunter, to acquire 21 works by emerging American artists. Among these works was Lichtenstein's monumental and really stunning painting, Forget It, Forget Me, which I'm sure we'll see tonight. The painting was completed, and a few months later, it was purchased by the Rose. And this was unusual because most museums continue to favor European art and etc. And the Rose led the way and was pioneering in buying young, emerging American artists, including Lichtenstein. Tonight, we are absolutely honored and excited to host one of the world's most important Lichtenstein scholars. Sorry, I'm so excited that I'm getting confused. So Avis Berman is on campus and here with us tonight. Thank you, Avis, for joining us and sharing your knowledge about the artist's formative years. So a brief introduction. Avis Berman is an independent writer and art historian. She has written very extensively on painting, sculpture, photography, design, and museum history. She is the author of, and I'll just note a few of her books, Rebels on 8th Street, Juliana Force and the Whitney Museum of American Art, James McNeill Whistler, Edward Hopper's New York, many other publications. Her articles and reviews have appeared in numerous journals and newspapers, including little ones like the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, Art News, Smithsonian, locally, the Boston Globe and the Washington Post, and more and more. In 2001, she helped establish the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation Oral History Program. And I think a lot of the materials that you gleaned from that you will share with us, thankfully, tonight. I could go on and on, but I want to just say that Avis is now working on the first biography of Roy Lichtenstein, and I can't wait to read it, so we keep on rushing her. And we are so honored to have you here with us tonight. The title of the lecture is Becoming Roy Lichtenstein. Thank you for coming, and please join me in welcoming Avis Berman.
Well, thank you so much for coming tonight. I am thrilled to be here. I have never seen your Lichtenstein painting before in person, and I've looked at a lot of Lichtensteins, and I was absolutely gobsmacked by the size, the scale, the power of that painting. So it's great to see the show. And I also want to say thank you for having me and having me tonight. You are really under the wire for the Lichtenstein centennial. Roy Lichtenstein was born on October 27th, 1923. Tomorrow will be his 101st birthday. This is the last day until midnight of his centennial, so we're just making it. However, today, October 26th, is sort of a special day for us in Lichtenstein world, because October 26th was and is the birthday of Roy Lichtenstein's widow, Dorothy Lichtenstein, and who died this summer and was an incredible force and a wonderful person herself. So she would hate this, but I respectfully want to dedicate this lecture to Dorothy on her birthday. Now, it doesn't take a village to do a lecture, but it does take kind of a coalition or tribe. So I really want to thank the people who helped me here and elsewhere. Ganit and Corey and Madeline Delphin at the museum were extremely helpful all the way through the various permutations from when we started. So I want to thank both of them. And at the Lichtenstein Foundation Archives and the Roy Lichtenstein Estate, I want to thank Justin Brancato, Allison Chomet, and Frank Avila Goldman. You wouldn't have the images you're about to see without them and without their permission. So I appreciate it. And one other thing I want to say is that normally I don't operate in this mode of discourse, but it can't be helped. Roy Lichtenstein and his peers operated in what I would call an oppressively white male world. So that is what you're going to see. However, I was very pleased to see the little painting by Rosalind Drexler in your show. Now, pop is always looked on as male, and until about the last 10 or 12 years when a lot of good work was done, because it seemed to be the only art movement in American art that had no women in it. And that is not true. There were at least 8 to 10 in New York alone that Roy Lichtenstein was friendly with, traded paintings, bought their work, were colleagues. And as a matter of fact, Rosalind Drexler and Roy were part of a circle around 63, 64 that used to meet every week in the winter to go skating in Central Park and hang out afterwards. So there really were more women in Lichtenstein's life professionally than these images that you see. And I just wanted to call attention to Roy's relationship with the women of pop art is a whole other story, so I can't get into it, but it deserves to be opened up in the future. So anyway, so to really begin, at first, Roy Lichtenstein was taken aback by what he'd done. Then he was spellbound. It was June 1961, and the painter, a 37-year-old assistant professor of art at Douglas College, was in, oh, thank you. Can everyone hear? Yes. Okay. Was in the upstairs bedroom that served as a studio in his house in Highland Park, New Jersey. For the past 3 years, he'd been producing paintings, excuse me, I haven't, composed in the shadow of abstract expressionism. The canvases consisted of stripes, broad wave-like ribbons of bright and lusciously swiped pigment. The canvases were deliberate and accomplished, but they could not have existed without the example of Willem de Kooning or Franz Klein. Indeed, by the late 1950s, abstract expressionism had devolved into a semi-academic exercise as flotillas of artists around the country emulated its mannerisms of angst and edginess conveyed through slashing brushstrokes. The New York dealers that Lichtenstein hoped would show his work did not warm to yet another version of diluted de Kooning. He had not been in a serious gallery since 1957, and unsold pictures were piling up around him. He supported his wife, his first wife, Isabel Lichtenstein, and young sons David and Mitchell by teaching. A paramount reason for his joining the faculty at Douglas, the women's branch of Rutgers University, was its proximity to the New York City art scene. As a colleague said, he was hell-bent on getting recognized there. Now, Lichtenstein had been preoccupied with reaching the top since the mid-50s, but nothing he did had attracted much notice. Then, one June day, Lichtenstein paid attention to a book his sons had. It was Walt Disney's Donald Duck, Lost and Found. On the cover, Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse are on a raft making for the shore. Because the book was a Disney product, readers discovered that shore inevitably meant Tom Sawyer's Island, an attraction at Disneyland. Lichtenstein was struck by an inside the book illustration of Donald and Mickey fishing in a cove. Donald, perched on the end of the dock, has hooked the edge of his own sailor jersey in the act of casting, and he's pulling himself skyward as he struggles to land a fish. Mickey, standing in back of him, covers his mouth to suppress a guffaw as Donald squawks, "Look, Mickey, I've hooked a big one." Rutgers and Douglas were essential to Lichtenstein's burgeoning artistic emancipation because the university was a cradle of free thinkers. He had a window not merely on the elders of the New York school, but also the emergent forces of risk takers who had chosen alternatives to it. Alan Capro, the father of happenings, which dispensed with the canvas and turned the work of art into a participatory event, taught at Rutgers and affected everyone around him. Nascent Fluxus artists Robert Watts and Jeffrey Hendricks taught at Douglas, and the sculptor George Siegel was an important presence in both places. They were also active in the New York gallery world. New Brunswick was a center of creative vitality where all varieties of oral, visual, and olfactory experiences from everyday life had the potential to be the stuff of art. This shift in Lichtenstein's milieu from relative cultural isolation to a high-functioning artist community sparked a shift in style. Lichtenstein would admit that his metamorphosis from prosaic abstract painter into someone who blatantly questioned the nature of art with pictures that had every quality, quote, that abstract expressionism repudiated, had the appearance of a miraculous event. And he credited Douglas for the difference. Capro, who had declared a walk down 14th Street is more amazing than any masterpiece, was influential, that Lichtenstein said. Capro opened his eyes to the fact that, quote, art doesn't need to look like art. In June 1961, with Mickey and Donald, Lichtenstein hooked the big idea of a lifetime. He decided to render the silly scene, but not in an artistic way. He would forego the application of the abstract expressionist frosting to use the language of the day, the same style found in comic strips, a byproduct of the cheap printing processes of newspaper reproductions. You see that Lichtenstein did not make an exact copy of the composition or palette of Grant and Totten's original. He cropped it to strip out everything but the foreground action, and he changed the rainbow of colors to a set of tightly limited choices, the primaries of red, blue, and yellow, plus black and white. This was the cost-saving palette of comic strips and bubblegum wrappers, rather than the higher echelon children's publications. Lichtenstein made his alleged facsimile cruder, ruder, and more aggressive than the source that inspired him. He wanted to remind people of a real comic book panel, which meant that he would adopt a graphic style and drop the hallmarks of 1950s paintings, like modulations of thick and thin paint and calligraphic lines. Also here, he added a dialogue balloon, whereas the original had the story narrative in lines below the illustration. And Lichtenstein said, I realized that this was a marked change from prevailing taste, because although almost anything seemed to be fair subject matter for art, commercial art, and particularly cartooning, were not considered to be one of those possibilities. The notion of presenting a cartoon image so it looked like a cartoon was more than outrageous. It was subversive. This canvas, his first painting with no expressionism in it, was titled Look, Mickey. Now, why did the results stun Lichtenstein? As someone with more than 20 years of training in art, he had a BFA and an MFA from Ohio State University, and he had been making art since he was a teenager. He had never considered commercial art or illustration to be on the same plane as high art. Pollock, de Kooning, and Klein's paintings were sanctified totems. This rebellion against the artists he venerated was almost psychologically unbearable for him. Lichtenstein's strength was his willingness to abandon the direction he was taking. Now he was dominating his material as opposed to seeing this unruly new development as a distraction from a perceived goal. The hindsight of history tends to reduce random incidents, contingencies, and complex events of a life into an inevitable progression, and believe me, biographers are subject to that. But beyond the many contributory episodes and circumstances that prepared him to be the artist he became, Lichtenstein was always who he was, because one of the most salient aspects of his artistic personality was consistency. His attraction to certain subjects and attitudes tended to be masked by the variety of styles he experimented with before finding his signature mode of expression in 1961. But he arrived at his fundamental artistic beliefs in the 1940s. Even as a young man, he was perplexed by pre-existing norms of taste that were supposedly so infallible in laying down the aesthetic law. In the early 1940s, when he was a student at Ohio State, Lichtenstein told a friend that the only thing he remembered being interested in was, quote, that it was confounding as to why one set of lines, somebody's drawings, was considered brilliant, and somebody else's that may have looked better to you was considered nothing by almost everyone. In 1996, a year before he died, Lichtenstein's thoughts were virtually identical. He commented, I was always interested in and always baffled by why are these few marks art and these few marks not art? Because you always hear, here's a very good drawing, it looks like to a novice, and it looks perfect and everything's fine. And here's some kind of jumble over here that everybody thinks is art. Are they being perverse? Or two similar ones where they're both technically good, but one is valued and the other isn't? That really used to consume me, end quote. Lichtenstein was obsessed with the question that thoughtful artists ask, what is art? In finding an answer, he did not aim to destroy painting, as his critics thought, but reshape it to include him. Roy Lichtenstein's life divides almost too neatly in half. It consists of the unknown years from 1923 to 61 and the years of acclaim from 1962 to 1997. However, because his aesthetic concerns remain remarkably stable through 6 decades, it's imperative to examine the underknown art and life that preceded the omnipresent oeuvre that everyone recognizes. Lichtenstein could not have formulated the art he invented in 1961 without what he learned in 1941 or attempted in 1951. He was an unlikely iconoclast. Born in Manhattan on October 27th, 1923, to a father in the real estate business and a musically talented mother, he had a comfortable childhood. A shy boy who always wanted to be an artist, Lichtenstein took Saturday morning watercolor classes at a local art school and listened to radio serials like Flash Gordon and Mandrake the Magician, which were based on comic strip superheroes. The 1939 to 40 New York World's Fair was a formative experience. There is no guesswork about its significance to him. It was the great visual event of Lichtenstein's early life. He did not so much visit it, but live in it, going numerous times. The fair was a hymn to industrial design, and the profession's titans, Norman Bel Geddes, Donald Deskey, Raymond Loewy, Russell Wright, and Walter Dorwin Teague created stunning pavilions for it. Lichtenstein's later artistic renditions of Depression-era motifs and images were drawn from the fair's streamlined architecture and overall design. And he poked fun at the ceaseless materialism hawked as social idealism. Enrolling in Ohio State University in Columbus in September 1940, Lichtenstein was shaped for life by Hoyt Sherman, a professor whom he always credited as the person who showed him how to see. Drawing from life, the title of Lichtenstein's first studio class with Sherman had a double meaning. It encompassed the traditional definition of participants drawing representation of people and objects put before them, but in this instance, it also signified that the art produced would be reliant on life, namely the physiological sensations of a human being. The teacher and creator of this unusual course of study was a maverick with charisma to burn, which I think you can see by that photo. Painter, theorist, and showman, Sherman could inspire anyone to be an artist. Now, Sherman taught that the visual organization of forms was paramount, that's usual, but students could not master that organization unless they could see more accurately. He introduced the notion of perceptual unity, a mode of vision that students had to understand and learn. To see in an organized and unified fashion, students had to apply Gestalt psychology to drawing and painting. Gestalt theory insists that the whole cannot be deduced from its individual parts, and viewers must learn to focus on entire patterns or configurations. Accordingly, Sherman contended that to see aesthetically, we must perceive the entire field of what is before us all at once, being an action taking place in front of our eyes or the lines on a canvas that contain the germ of composition. Now, Sherman instituted techniques that improved his students' optical proficiency. He put them in a darkened room and had them draw an object or a model's pose in a few seconds as a memory exercise. He also trained their instantaneous vision, their peripheral vision, and the ability to distinguish differences in tone. Once someone's eye skills were sharpened, he or she would be able to see an entire visual environment simultaneously, and foreground and background would be equally important. Now, Lichtenstein paid tribute to Sherman's theories and applications throughout his career. Whether or not the theory holds water doesn't even matter. Lichtenstein believed it and made it work for him. Now, an early and sub rosa autobiographical pop painting that is a nod to Sherman's governing quest, which is a comparison first advanced by the scholar Michael Lobel in his book on Lichtenstein, Image Duplicator. Now, even though the title, I Can See the Whole Room and There's Nobody in It, comes straight from the dialogue balloon in a panel of Steve Roper, an adventure comic strip drawn by William Overgaard and written by Alan Saunders, it happened to be an encapsulation of Sherman's admonition to see an entire visual field at once, a matchup that Lichtenstein must have seized on with glee. Overgaard's image, which Lichtenstein redrew and expanded, could be a stand-in for a Sherman exercise in perception. We are positioned in a darkened space, looking toward an open aperture with a man's face on the other side. From behind the peephole, the man looks directly at us, yet proclaims he sees no one in the room, for of course, we, the viewers, don't exist for him. Now, the room in the universe of the painting is a black space, not unlike Sherman's classroom. The cartoon male, his head bathed in light while his eyes penetrate the dark, would have to possess heightened visual acuity, the kind inculcated by Sherman, to be able to synthesize a total impression so quickly. Only someone who had experienced his teaching could adjust so smoothly to the change from blazing light to pitch black. And Lichtenstein said that ultimately Sherman, quote, gave me a direction, not a style, but a way of attacking it, and a way of seeing and making relationships. With World War II on, military service was inevitable, and Lichtenstein was drafted in February 1943. He spent nearly 2 years in training before being shipped to Europe in late 1944, and he saw action in France, Belgium, and Germany. And you still see in the painting in the middle, he still had time to visit the museum. These experiences provided him with a sardonic view of military pomp and machismo that would surface in his later satires of war and industrial power. Returning to Ohio State in 1946, Lichtenstein finished his BFA on the GI Bill and joined the art faculty as an instructor. In 1949, he earned an MFA and married Isabel Wilson, who worked in an artist-run gallery in Cleveland. Now, from the beginning, really, very early, Lichtenstein was on the idea of appropriation, the intentional adaptation and imitation of pre-existing images. And it can be found in his work starting in the late 1940s, when he painted faux naive canvases of medieval knights, castles, and maidens in distress, which were inspired by an illustrated book he had on the Bayeux tapestry. And you can see he didn't copy those exactly, but again, he was based on that. And Lichtenstein's determination to make works based on printed images rather than life was a corollary of another core belief he already had, which is that art is not based on nature. It is always based on other art, which guides what we see and what we think we see. And this premise, his art always annotating other art, remained the crux of his work. So let's return to how consistent Lichtenstein was in his ideas, no matter what the outward appearance of a painting seemed to be. After the medieval imagery, Lichtenstein was painting humorous takeoffs on 19th century American history paintings, which in the late 1940s and early 1950s were considered embarrassingly provincial, the nadir of artistic experience. Well before Lichtenstein made his first cartoon painting, paraphrasing, particularly the paraphrasing of low-rent images, was an essential feature of his art. What others dismissed as trifling fascinated him as classic and idealized. In his words, a purely American mythological subject matter. In the 1940s and 50s, 19th century paintings were official art that had become retardataire. In the early 1960s, abstract expressionism was the highest art of the previous generation, but younger artists were restive and tired of working in what had been validated as the reigning style. In the early 1950s, when Lichtenstein took a pointed look at 19th century history paintings, he was moving closer to his objective of examining truth, myth, conventions, and cliches in American life. And it was no accident that in 1951, on the 100th anniversary of his target, Emanuel Lewitz's Washington Crossing the Delaware, the most famous American historical painting, Lichtenstein created 2 witty send-ups of it. Bloated with iconic status, this visual behemoth was a natural choice for parody. Lichtenstein's Crossing the Delaware 2 shows a frontal view of Washington, an oarsman, and a flag bearer standing in a craft so minimal it could be a raft. The figures are flat and insect-like. Their unpretentious renderings contrast purposely with the stateliness of the picture Lichtenstein was debunking. Leutz's ambition for his canvas, which is more than 12 feet high and 21 feet long, was to be stirring, not humorous. The horizontal composition achieves its forward thrust by having the prow of Washington's boat, as well as Washington and his officers appear in profile. They lead men and supplies across the icy river, and the cascade of boats spreads through several zones of space. As the men push onward, revivifying sunlight breaks in the distance. Leutze paints an unstoppable force. Lichtenstein sketches a scruffy enterprise on the verge of capsizing. Now, the combination of a neoclassical composition and works of art that became vehicles for nationalistic iconography figured in an even more telling painting from 1951. Lichtenstein interpreted John Vanderlyn's 1804 The Death of Jane McCrae, which was reproduced in the July 30th, 1950 issue of Life magazine, which he saw and used. He did not go to Hartford, Connecticut. Unlike the epic military turning point of Washington crossing the Delaware, this incident let Vanderlyn make partisan hay with the captivity narrative of a white woman stolen by the other, stoking incendiary racial fears and fanning patriotic propaganda. Two burly Native Americans stripped to the waist are about to scalp the terrified Jane. She is begging for her life in a gown with a tight low-cut bodice that exposes her breast. Assumptions that her killers will rape and murder her are inevitable. Her death, which occurred in 1777, was manipulated as an atrocity to enrage white colonials against the British and their tribal allies. McCrae, a Tory sympathizer during her life, became a revolutionary heroine after her capture and death, which may have been accidental and not by Native Americans at all. She entered the annals of American folklore along with Pocahontas and Betsy Ross. As such, the death of Jane McCrae exemplifies how mass media and visual images can contort history, which would have drawn Lichtenstein to altering it. His cubist rendering of the three figures retains Vanderlyn's triangular composition and balanced forms, but McCrae's face is summarized like a cartoon in 2 lines and 2 circles. The Indians are equally doll-like, neither bloodthirsty nor hyper-masculine. In fact, McCrae dominates the canvas, crowding her foes out of the foreground. And as Lichtenstein dismantles the veracity of the kidnapping myth. There's no crisis, emotional intensity has been drained away, gender roles not polarized, McCrae is not in anguish, and the braves are ineffectual. Lichtenstein's Jane McCrae is a witty work and one that lays siege to the artificiality of gender conventions and challenges indoctrination in history painting, but it is gentle. Later on, in the cartoon paintings, masculine and feminine characters are portrayed at extremes, as Vanderlyn did, and in the midst of a comic book style wrenching moment. Now, reflecting on his parodies of American history, Lichtenstein said, "I was adding an American something to it, but it really wasn't a new way of looking. I think the paintings work okay. Some of them are kind of cute. They're not the same as anybody else's, but they really didn't tell you something you didn't know. The pop did." Lichtenstein's send-ups are flavored with his own brand of humor, but they remain within regulation boundaries of taste. He was still working within an idiom rather than inventing a new one. In 1950, Lichtenstein was denied tenure at OSU because the department head felt he was never going to amount to anything as an artist. Seriously, I've seen the letter. The guy wrote to Lichtenstein that as an artist, quote, he lacked the unquestioned evidence of substantial growth and future promise. So if there are any artists in the audience, it's like getting a bad review, it's worth nothing. Lichtenstein was given a year's notice, and in fall 1951, he and Isabel moved to Cleveland. Isabel Lichtenstein became an interior decorator specializing in modern design with a clientele of upper middle class Cleveland families. Whereas her career was on the rise, Lichtenstein never taught at the university level. He had a trickle of part-time jobs, including window dresser and painting numbers on mechanical dials for an electrical instrument company, and many of his sales were to Isabel's clients. They bought art and commissioned pieces of furniture from him. In 1954, the Lichtenstein's first son, David, was born. 2 years later, their second child, Mitchell, followed. By the late 1950s, the Lichtenstein's marriage was strained. Isabel had a successful business, but she was an alcoholic and more dependent on liquor. Lichtenstein never found employment commensurate with his professional experience or ambition. He wound up as a draftsman at Republic Steel and felt that he was losing his identity as an artist. To salvage his career, he accepted a position as an assistant professor at the State University of New York in Oswego in the northern reaches of the state. Lichtenstein began teaching industrial design and painting in Oswego in September 1957. In Oswego, the winters were brutal and Isabel lacked fulfilling work. It seemed like a complete disaster for them, but if Lichtenstein had not gone there, Douglas College would not have happened. And he came tantalizingly close to the idiom that would transform his subject matter into an aesthetically vital concept. In early 1958, he produced paintings inhabited by a smiling Mickey Mouse, a yawping Donald Duck, and a particularly insouciant Bugs Bunny. But these refugees from the lowly comic books were too unrehabilitated for art, and Lichtenstein legitimatized them by embedding them in brushy expressionist backgrounds that again were indebted to de Kooning. Lichtenstein was not ready for the implications of such recombinant contrast. They must have struck him as Art Frankenstein's. He destroyed the canvases, although he kept several studies as mementos. And these are the studies, and oops, sorry, not right.
Press too hard.
Anyway, and these are really all we have left. So in the parochial artistic environment of Oswego, he had little encouragement to take a creative leap. There was no Capro there. On the verge of a thumping discovery, he turned away. The cartoon images did not galvanize his thinking, but we could see that they remained painterly. He had yet to arrive at the crucial insight that he had to get the artiness out of his art. At the same time, Lichtenstein was working in that fully abstract style, dependent on sweeps of dramatic brushstrokes. Another mannerism he would satirize in a few years. You can see that the big painting 6 was just as swashbuckling as any 1950s abstraction he was burlesquing. Within the joke was an homage because he loved those artists, Pollock, de Kooning, Klein. Now, Oswego's main advantage was that it took less time to drive to Manhattan than it did from Cleveland. When Lichtenstein took the job there, he rationalized that it was closer to New York ideologically as well as geographically, but the industrial arts department, where he spent so many of his days, was long on conformity and short on enthusiasm. Lichtenstein had always followed developments in New York through the art magazines, and I think you could argue that a scintilla of his practice of working from images was related to seeing most of the art that he did through reproductions for roughly 25 years. Because he saw a Jasper Johns painting on the cover of Art News, Lichtenstein went to the first solo show of the 27-year-old Jasper Johns in January 1958 at the Leo Castelli Gallery. Johns, as well as his friend, collaborator, and lover, Robert Rauschenberg, had been artists to watch since the mid-1950s when they dispensed with abstract expressionism. It was never as quote unquote pure as when they did it. Lichtenstein knew about Rauschenberg too, because he had seen his work at the Stable Gallery, another pioneering cenacle for emerging artists. Both were in group shows at Castelli in 1957, the year the gallery was founded. Their appearance, along with that of the sculptor Marisol Escobar, telegraphed Castelli's shift from a regulation purveyor of abstract expressionism and the School of Paris to a unique outpost of a burgeoning and irreverent avant-garde. Johns's show, which cemented his status as a significant artist, consisted of 18 objects created between 1955 and 1957 that elided the boundaries between painting and sculpture with consummate control. Johns's show, Calvin Tompkins wrote, hit the art world like a meteor, and the repercussions were felt from Milan to Tokyo. The hegemony of abstract expressionism was over. Now, along with Castelli, Lichtenstein used to visit Betty Parsons, Sidney Janis, and Martha Jackson galleries, all of which showed contemporary American and European art. And he probably heard about the Rubin and Judson galleries, which were wild, dissident scenes where happenings and other untraditional installations by artists like Klaus Oldenburg, Red Rooms, Jim Dime, and Capro were staged. In early 1960, Lichtenstein was providentially rescued. Another instructor from Oswego recommended to his friend, who was the head of the art department at Douglas, that he consider hiring Lichtenstein. Lichtenstein was hired as of July 1960 and started teaching in September. Lichtenstein and the Times now begin to mirror each other. In American art and politics, the 60s would usher in a new frontier, which, as John F. Kennedy said, not all horizons had been explored. The inwardness and high seriousness of the New York School and abstract expressionism would unwillingly give ground to a loose group of brash artists, many of them representational, as well as those experimenting in performance and other event-driven spaces. Lichtenstein's version of the new frontier would be a nameless comic realism, which would later be titled pop art. No one knew what to call it in 1961 and 62. Names like New Realism and Commonism did not stick. In 1960, Lichtenstein was a less adventurous painter than his Douglas colleagues. He continued with abstract paintings consisting of waves of pigment that resembled ribbon candy. He was still painting that way as late as April 1961, but as we know, by the end of June, he had painted Look Mickey, and he said, I got interested in organizing it as a painting and brought it to some kind of a conclusion as an aesthetic statement, which I hadn't intended to do. And then I really went back to my other way of painting, or tried to, but I had this cartoon painting in my studio and it was a little too formidable. I couldn't keep my eyes off it, and it prevented me from painting any other way. At first, the change was a little too strong for me. I had it on my easel for a week. I just wanted to see what it looked like. I tried to make it a work of art. I wasn't trying just to copy. I realized that this was just so much more compelling, and I think that's how he said that just shows you just, you know, how can you talk about something like this? You don't, and when you reflect on it later, the rationales come in later. And now I would say the pace of art history speeds up via Alan Capro. The Capro and Lichtenstein families had children of about the same age, and they socialized as they did in June and July of '61. In July, the Capros were at the Lichtenstein's house. The men were in Lichtenstein's studio, and Capro saw Look Mickey and other early paintings in the new style, like Popeye. And Capro said, I was for a moment put off, but only for a moment, when I saw the cartoon. I thought, this is it. So we sat there and plotted how he was going to get this into a gallery so he could be noticed for cartoons. I could see he really wasn't interested in an avant-garde little gallery. He wanted the big time. Luckily for Lichtenstein, Capro had an old friend named Ivan Karp. Karp was Castelli's manager and critical in making the gallery, as Karp said, the outpost for really threatening new things. But the meeting would have to wait until the fall because New York galleries were inactive in the summer. In the meantime, Lichtenstein had to produce more paintings and, of course, decisively sever himself from his former way of working. Now, Lichtenstein burst forth with paintings taken from comic books and advertisements, including Popeye, Washing Machine, The Engagement Ring, and Girl with Ball without hesitation. They depicted things that Americans live with: trash cans, transistor radios, hot dogs, laundry soap. But the art historian Robert Rosenblum wrote, these things had always been kept far away from the sacred spaces where art was to be worshipped. Among the paintings that Lichtenstein completed for his appointment Castelli was a real forerunner of the rose painting. In the summer of '61, when Lichtenstein embarked on paintings derived from cartoon characters like Mickey, Donald, and Popeye, which were from children's comics and instantly recognizable icons of American popular culture, images of generic women from adult type sources appeared shortly thereafter. The Engagement Ring is Lichtenstein's first adaptation from a romance comic and the first pop ancestor of Forget It, Forget Me. Now in this, he retained more of the infelicities from the original source of the Engagement Ring than he would in later canvases when he was more practiced and more ruthless in smoothing out awkward draftsmanship, eliminating inessentials, and heightening the emotional impact. With more experience, he would remove the evidence of his touch, which is appealingly expressed in the uneven and obviously handmade application of the Ben-Day dots, the newspaper process for simulating textures, skin tones, and color gradations, and one of Lichtenstein's most radical stylistic innovations that he transferred into art. At this stage, Lichtenstein was still looking for a method to paint the dots uniformly enough to replicate mechanical painting. And I think if you go and look at the roses painting, you'll see that Roy was still hand dotting on his own, because you'll see all sorts of little mistakes in there, which aren't, we don't mind as mistakes because you know what person did it, but he hadn't found the right stencils yet. You can also see, though, that Lichtenstein heightened the atmospheric tension if you compare it with the original cartoon, which is not only in black and white, but less fraught. He alters the expression of the eyes, makes the head more angular, and pushes the woman's head into the foreground, almost surging out of the picture plane. You don't quite know what's going on narratively. By taking one panel and isolating it, Lichtenstein has eliminated the anecdote, the clutter, and deprived us of a resolution. And that's why I think that Forget It, Forget Me is descended from the Engagement Ring, although Lichtenstein has sharpened and tightened the composition in your picture. Here are some other paintings that tease you about the meaning. Lichtenstein drops us into the middle of an unexplained incident, adroitly blending voyeurism. He thrusts the viewer in between the man and the woman, and discretion by not always revealing what they're thinking or saying. They are slices of narratives that stay unresolved, unlike the neatly wrapped up endings of comic books. Now, to return to 1961, another crucial painting was Girl with Ball, which was based on an ad in the New York Times for a resort in the Poconos. Besides tailoring the commercial source to his needs, Lichtenstein again adopted the graphic conventions of cartoon and newspaper reproductions, unmodulated flat colors, black outlines, and the Ben-Day dots. This painting was not originally these colors, but they whatever he used became more greenish. The girl in the painting is a standard American beauty queen and a prototype of his later pretty girls. Her nose is drawn as two commas and a parentheses, not the way a nose looks in real life, and her red mouth is similarly delineated in a commercial shorthand unrelated to anatomical accuracy. Obviously, there are no spaces to show the teeth. The features are signs for themselves that will be recognized by any viewer. Through dissecting the popular communication of beauty, Lichtenstein is delving into the psychology of perception as well as the tricks of media persuasion. As such, Girl with Ball became a touchstone of his art, just to drive home what Lichtenstein was onto about what we see versus what we think we see. I want to show you the comic source for I Can See the Whole Room. Now, in its form as a tiny comic strip panel, the iris and eyeball read as an eye. But if you blow it up, as Lichtenstein did, you see that the eye is really 3 dots. Now, after an initial appointment in September, Lichtenstein joined the Castelli Gallery in October 1961, which was something of a nail biter. Although Karp was an immediate enthusiast, Castelli took a while to make up his mind, and other artists in the gallery, who included Rauschenberg-Johns and Frank Stella, disliked the work and wanted nothing to do with it. Even Karp initially said, "You can't do this." But like Lichtenstein himself, when he first painted Look Mickey, Karp could not look away. Lichtenstein's first one-person show took place in February 1962, and the press was beside itself. Clement Greenberg, the champion of Pollock, and David Smith, and the most influential American art critic, wrote off pop as a novelty that lacked staying power. It was too frivolous to qualify as art. The New York Times' Brian O'Doherty gloomily noted that Lichtenstein had added an unworthy graft to the body of art, and there seems to be nothing one can do to stop it. But the collectors bought, private collectors rather than museums at first, and Lichtenstein was launched. Even in these early pop works, Lichtenstein provocatively challenged cultural orthodoxy through a motif that has preoccupied artists, especially male artists, for thousands of years: the female face and figure. Most of the paintings of women that followed the engagement ring and Girl with Ball between 1961 and 1964 were lifted from another discounted or artistic source, as the engagement ring was: romance comic books and strips marketed to adolescent girls. They were aspirational literature in an era in which the mass media preached that the main destiny of unmarried, white, middle-class women was to get and keep a man. Without their dream men, the protagonists, all ideally and blankly beautiful with upturned noses, succulently parted lips, abundant hair, and slim figures, are in suspended animation comparable to the helpless damsels Lichtenstein laughed at in his paraphrases of medieval narratives. Readers learned that their destiny was heartbreak, but it was always the temporary comic book heartbreak as opposed to true or lasting suffering. The last story panel is inevitably a long kiss that heals all misunderstandings. The flatness in the paintings corresponded with the emotional level that was offered or exploited. In employing the visual language of popular imagery, Lichtenstein was questioning the meaning of cultural attributes themselves. Did they represent anything anymore? Lichtenstein was not aiming for social commentary, but in skewering hackneyed visual conventions, he could not help but undercut the overwhelming message in the comic books for teenagers and the magazines for adults that women were incomplete without a man. No matter how formalist Lichtenstein may have been in intent in his treatment of portrayals of women, he contributed to the dissent against a pernicious social myth. Lichtenstein introduced his women in romantic anguish and bliss, while Betty Friedan was writing her landmark manifesto, The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963. His paintings of 62 to 64 satirized images promulgated in books, magazines, movies, and comic books of women desperately seeking perfect love. Such paintings as Good Morning, Darling, and Blonde Waiting were ironic illustrations for Friedan's thesis about the dominant culture, that the dream existence being sold to women was to want no greater glory than subservient femininity. Life was supposed to be a Douglas Sirk movie for us. While he was creating the comic based portrayals of women, Lichtenstein was also investigating how much the part could stand for the whole, how much a suggestion could improve on declaration. In Washing Machine and Spray, Lichtenstein conveyed the female presence with a partial image, a manicured hand pouring detergent or pushing down an aerosol button. Consumerism and commercial merchandise quickly linked to pop art and its perceived triviality were equated with the feminine and domestic realms. As the principal shoppers for household products and appliances, women were viewed as naively susceptible to advertising blandishments. If the female body was the object of the male gaze, the female gaze could be duped by advertising into accepting household products and appliances as objects of desire. By the time of Lichtenstein's second solo exhibition at Castelli in September 1963, his work had been showcased in museums around the country, and he was able to quit teaching in 1964. He had become Roy Lichtenstein as we know him, a hip hop artist. He was usually grouped with Rauschenberg, Johns, Warhol, Oldenburg, Rosenquist, Siegel, Dine, Robert Indiana, and Tom Wesselman, because they restored impudence to mainstream painting. And in case people don't know, the woman in the picture, Jean Shrimpton, was one of the big supermodels of the British supermodels of the 60s. The other one was Twiggy. And his work no longer merely echoed the times. It was often prophetic, predicting cultural movements that would inflame the decade. At the same time that he decimated the message that women had little value without a man, he saw that orthodox social expectations for men were equally absurd. These paintings of hopped up military exploits for men and lacerate the stereotypes of male daring do and high octane macho conduct. Now, his acerbic take on the folly of glorifying nationalistic cliches, which we saw from the 50s, coincided with major political miscalculations and military debacles like the invasion of Cuba, the nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union, and our involvement with Vietnam. Later in the 60s, Lichtenstein bored in on the military-industrial complex. He stopped making such work in 1970 when he came to believe that he was taking advantage of the subject rather than debunking it. He said, "Much of our foreign policy has been unbelievably terrifying, but this is not what my work is about, and I don't want to capitalize on this popular position. My work is more about our American definition of images and visual communication." Once dismissed as a purveyor of trivia and accused of the crime of being anti-art, Roy Lichtenstein created a body of work that has outlasted his critics and still has the power to entertain and to astonish. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that riveting talk. I'm sure we all learned a lot. So thank you, Avis. Thank you all for joining us. I encourage you to go see Lichtenstein 100 at the Rose Art Museum. I think after hearing this, it will come alive even more. It's up until December 29th. 2004. We also have a virtual screening of Michael Blackwood's documentary on Roy Lichtenstein. It will be available for 1 week starting tomorrow, Lichtenstein's birthday. And you can access the documentary by registering on the Rose Art Museum website. I want to thank Maddie Delfa, who put this all together, and our technicians, and all of you, and very much Avis Berman. Thank you. Thank you. That was perfect, like that was the hour, that was perfect timing.